So looking for new employment at a firm because I don't want to do rap. So yes.
Connect with me. I have tons of folks looking for my PR people.
Oh, yay.
See, I didn't have to do a shout out. We're networking.
I got one this morning.
Thank you. Tell her I'm the bomb, Dr. Caruth.
You broke up.
Okay, we are live on YouTube.
Live, guys.
Okay.
We are streaming live on YouTube.
Okay. So we're waiting for Rob to reconnect. Oh, here he comes.
Okay. Okay, Rob is here. Rob, are you able to hear? Yes. Okay, about to go live, and at 6:05, I'll stop the spotlight on me.
Hello? Yep. How's that?
Is that better?
Feedback.
Wow. Okay.
I think you would have to
Sorry about this.
audio for one of those.
Okay, I'm starting to hear now. Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties, folks. I am finally in the room and pleased to be here.
Awesome. Patrick, we ready to go? Excellent. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marathon Don't Stop, the life and times of Nipsey Hussle. We are so pleased to bring to you an engaging event about hip hop and how Nipsey Hussle changed the game, how his genius extended far beyond music and into the community, literally building a social justice movement around helping Black people in LA. So tonight we'll be talking with Rob Kenner, the author of The Marathon Don't Stop, The Life and Times of Nipsey Hussle, which is now a New York Times best-selling book I encourage you all to buy it. It is well written and provides lots of context and history about the Black community in LA, but also Nipsey Hussle's contribution to the community. Later on in the show, we will have time for Q&A from the audience. So audience members, use the Q&A function on Zoom. Make sure you post your questions in there, and we will get to as many of them as possible near the end of the show. In the meantime, I bring to you Dean Lewis, Associate Dean Lewis, and Associate Dean Tyree to bring greetings from their respective colleges. Thank you.
Good evening. I bring you greetings from the College of Arts and Sciences, Office of the Dean at Howard University. I'm Dr. Kim Michelle Lewis, Associate Dean of Research and Professor of Physics. This event is hosted by the Howard University Digital Informers and Scholars with support from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. The Knight Foundation is a national foundation that seeks to strengthen democracy by supporting informed and engaged communities. Recently, the Knight Foundation launched an initiative to catalyze new research to inform how technology is transforming our democracy. Currently, the foundation is supporting the Howard University Digital Informers Project with a $250,000 grant to study democratic knowledge in Black urban communities in Washington, D.C. The digital informers are focusing on engaging with Black and marginalized communities in and around the nation's capital. This is one such event. This collaborative and interdisciplinary effort hopes to combat misinformation about the politics and democracy while safeguarding these communities among cyber manipulation. As you know, there is no shortage of talent and scholarly activities at Howard University, and you will see that this evening when the digital informers are introduced. Thank you for tuning in, and welcome to the conversation, The Marathon Don't Stop, The Life and Times of Nipsey Hussle. Now I turn to my colleague, Interim Associate Dean, Dr. Tia Tyree, for welcome remarks from the School of Communications.
Again, thank you so much for having me. I'll be very brief. I'm just going to make 4 quick points and to say that it is always wonderful to have conversations about hip hop and higher education. This is a unique group who believes that there is a place for hip hop in higher education. Not everyone believes that. I am happy to say that my dissertation was about hip hop. I've advised several other students whose dissertations have been on hip hop, and I've worked to create a course where hip hop is the center point. And I can drop something on this group that you may or may not know, that I'm a part of a select group who are working very hard to bring hip hop to Howard in a major way through a minor. And so maybe it won't happen next year, but very soon we will announce, hopefully, that we will have a minor in hip hop, which will be amazing for us at the Mecca. The other thing I want to mention is that it's important that we acknowledge that heroes come in all shapes, sizes, races, and occupations. And being here today celebrating Nipsey is really a validation that you don't have to be a Kamala Harris. Even though we acknowledge how amazing she is, our heroes are different. And for people who grew up in the inner city, me growing up in Baltimore, we see different types of heroes. And it's important that we take a moment to say, hip hop has several heroes that many of us look up to. And I'm pleased to be here to bring acknowledgements and voice to someone that many people saw as a hometown hero. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dean Lewis and Dean Tyree. It really is nice to have the support of the administration, and more importantly, the idea of having a minor in hip hop at the Mecca just really reinforces what some of our scholars are already doing. For instance, Brandon Hogan. Dr. Hogan is an associate professor in philosophy at Howard University. His work mostly focuses on thinking about legal punishment and racial justice, but he also teaches classes about the philosophy of hip hop. And tonight he's going to share some of his insights on how to study hip hop.
All right, welcome everyone. So I've always been, not always, but been interested in hip hop for a while. I think I approach hip hop from a philosophical perspective. So a little bit what I'm going to talk about tonight is the philosophy that's within hip hop, and how hip hop is philosophical, and how academics and philosophers can learn from hip hop artists. Um, so it is the case that I think hip hop had me thinking about philosophy prior to me knowing what philosophy was. So I listened to Arrested Development, KRS-One, Wu-Tang, Tupac, who were rife with philosophical ideas, but I didn't know to call them like philosophical ideas. And I think it's also the case that hip hop itself is very academic, if you think about its structure. So I'm just going to talk about a few ways that hip hop is academic, and then talk about the ways that we can think about hip hop academically, or from an academic perspective. Um, right, so hip hop artists have pretty explicit citation practices. So Lil Wayne says this explicitly. He says, like, I'm going to cite a Kanye West line. Like, I'm going to say this line just like Kanye West said it, because like he's brilliant. And we know that Jay-Z cites Biggie all the time, right? You won't listen to a Jay-Z album after Biggie died without Jay-Z citing Biggie. You kind of have to know what he's doing. Right, hip hop is academic in the sense that a lot of the artists have shared references that you have to know, or lingo you have to know in order to get what's going on. So one example, we think about Pusha T's album Daytona, right? In the album, he says, like, this is my purple tape. So if you're not in hip hop, you have no idea what it means to say, this is my purple tape. But what he means is he's referencing Raekwon's debut album, Only Built for Cuban Links. So Only Built for Cuban Links, when it came out in the cassette, the very first prints were Transparent Purple. And that's just a classic hip hop album, right? So when Pusha T said, this is my purple tape, say, yo, this is my thing. And for good or bad, academics do the same, right? Those are references that you kind of have to be in the know to know. Right, you also see new ideas coming out of hip hop in the same way you see new ideas coming out of academia. So obviously, I like Wu-Tang. My example is Ghostface. Right? So Ghostface in his later career is creating new slang, doing stream of consciousness rapping. And the same, one of my favorites too, like MF Doom, invented just completely different rhyme schemes that you don't see in other places. Right, so you see people kind of getting their PhD in hip hop. Right, they start off, and then at certain points, like, oh, you kind of a doctor of hip hop now when you're able to invent your own style. And we also see this personal evolution in hip hop. Right, you see Jay-Z from his beginning of his career to his career now talking about going to therapy and talking about making wise investments and having good credit, which is something you wouldn't imagine in the '80s. Hip hop artists talking about credit, but here we are with Jay-Z. Right, and the last aspect is that we see that there's a notion of mentorship. So academics have a doctoral advisor, and a lot of hip hop artists have their mentors. Right, so you can't imagine Eminem without Dr. Dre, or Kanye without Jay-Z, or Drake without Lil Wayne. So the structure is somewhat similar. And interestingly, I think that hip hop is very philosophical, right? So the line that comes to mind is Kweli's line, right? Life without knowledge is death in disguise. Or KRS-One, right? He has a whole song called My Philosophy. And I think that philosophy can be very hip hop at times. So my prime example is Friedrich Nietzsche. So Friedrich Nietzsche has a book titled Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, where he's comparing himself to Christ. Thinking about Jay-Z, Jehovah. So we think about the chapters of Ecce Homo, they sound like hip hop tracks. So chapter 1 of Ecce Homo is why I am so wise. Chapter 2 is why I am so clever. Chapter 3 is why I write such good books. And chapter 4 is why I am a destiny. So I immediately saw a connection between philosophy and hip hop. And in my time at Howard, I tried to develop a course on philosophy and hip hop that explores some overlapping themes, overlapping interests. So I'll just talk about a few, connecting to the larger things that we're going to talk about. Right, so in philosophy, we have this notion of figuring out kind of what we're doing, right? What does it mean to do philosophy? What's the purpose of philosophy, right? Some people think it's to make our lives better. So some people think that philosophy is continuous with science. And some think that philosophy is just about solving conceptual problems. And you see the parallel debates in hip hop. So some think that hip hop is about raising consciousness or being woke. Some think that hip hop is about just being fun. Some think that hip hop is just a form of self-expression. So you have this debate coming out when people talk about this is real hip hop versus this is not real hip hop. Two, right? Obviously, philosophers talk about religion. Right? We ask questions like, does God exist? Is it rational to believe in God? And these dialogues are running throughout hip hop from beginning till like any album that was dropped yesterday. Right, so Biggie's song, right, "Suicidal Thoughts," where he's talking about not wanting to go to heaven because, like, why would I want to hang out with good people? Like, I'm a bad person. We have Dead Prez saying that religion itself is propaganda, and we know that a lot of hip hop artists are 5%ers, right, an offshoot of the Nation of Islam. So I actually published a paper a few years ago about the theme of death in hip hop, which is obviously a theme that pops up in philosophy as well. So some of the big philosophical questions are, right, is death itself a harm? Are you harmed by your death? Or is it the case that death is not a harm, something that we shouldn't fear because death just means the end of you? And we see hip hop artists meditating on death as well. So Tupac has the famous line, "My only fear of death is coming back reincarnated." Clips has a whole song and video about death called "My Funeral," a beach funeral, where they contemplate what they want to happen at their funerals. And as we know, what the late DMX talked a lot about death and worried about death because he kind of saw it coming around the corner. Two, right, so many of you have heard of philosophers known as existentialists who want to think about the nature of authenticity in human being. This is, I think, that one of the biggest things in hip hop, right? Hip hop artists are asking what it means to keep it real, to be true to yourself. So I could go on and on about the songs that are about, right, keeping it real and staying true. And finally, just in terms of politics, we know that both philosophers and hip hop artists think a lot about criminal justice, right? So philosophers ask questions like, right, what does it mean for something to be a crime? Right, what is the purpose of punishment? In hip hop, you see a more kind of explicit answer to this question. So we know NWA's F the police, and there are conversations about what does justice look like outside of the system, right? Street justice. Like Jay-Z says, if you kill my dog, I'm gonna kill your cat. That's the unwritten rules of rap. So I see a lot of just parallels. And I don't think it's the case that, so there's one way of thinking about studying hip hop in academia where hip hop is an object of study, which I think is the wrong way. I think the way to think about hip hop is that we are co-thinkers. So Nipsey Hussle has something to teach me and I have something to teach someone in hip hop as well. And to tell you the truth, I think sometimes rap lyrics are more clear, deep and powerful and thoughtful than some articles that are written in philosophy. So I definitely think this is an appropriate forum to think about Nipsey Hussle. And I think Nipsey Hussle is an appropriate object to talk about because he was philosophical, right? He's not just thinking about music, but he's thinking about spirituality, thinking about community uplift as well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think we're the perfect people to do it.
Thank you, Dr. Hogan. So appreciate you bringing us the foundational concepts of philosophy and hip hop. And now we're going to hear from Dr. Bahiyyah Muhammad. She's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Howard University. And her work focuses on the family and children of individuals who are incarcerated. But more importantly, she focuses on what it means to be Black and living in urban communities and urban spaces, and what does that mean for us as a community? Dr. Muhammad.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be on this esteemed panel of digital informers. And thank you so much, Dr. Hogan, for laying that beautiful foundation from a philosophical perspective. I'm going to be leaning more into the sociological and criminological perspectives as it relates to misinformation, specifically misinformation and disinformation as it revolves around the use of hip hop, specifically hip hop artists. For today, I want to talk about an individual that we're here to honor. May he rest in peace and may his family be uplifted throughout this process. That we find a lot of our greats living and their images being erased, specifically because of the different kinds of images often perpetuated through the media that takes away the concept of being a father or being a husband or being a loving individual. Specifically, when we talk about Nipsey Hussle, he was affectionately known as Neighborhood Nip within his community, you know, a Grammy-nominated artist, an entrepreneur, and a philanthropist. But oftentimes there's this concept of misinformation that he was only a part of a gang or an individual connected to a part of society that destroys communities. And oftentimes that is overshadowed, specifically in Black communities, that leads individuals to not be seen as the individuals who they are. Nipsey Hussle was not, you know, just a young and beloved or a father of two or, you know, in a relationship with Lauren London. He was also a strong Black man and community entrepreneur who was lauded and well known for his life, not just of his music, but specifically of his service to the Black communities. In the days after his death, there was a lot of, you know, conversation and talk about what he did for the Black community in South LA, but most people didn't realize how far-reaching his activism and his entrepreneurship really was. Oftentimes, individuals wanted to just use this kind of concept of misinformation and talk about him in a way that he was just an individual that was a part of the Crips. But when you think about the history of what Crips stood for, that stands for community, revolution, and progress. And oftentimes individuals fail to realize the framework for what that means for community activism. When I thought about the remarks that I wanted to give as it relates to this book talk about the life of Nipsey Hussle, I felt that it was important to highlight the concepts of how he resisted against this dialogue to be what others envisioned him to be. Living in a community that oftentimes lauds you on having to get out, he fought against that particular preface of staying in, buying businesses and ownership in areas and communities in which once he was a street hustler, and then turning that into a way to give jobs to hundreds of individuals across the community. And not only engaging in conversations with them, but also through leadership. For example, with the LAPD. He was in the beginning stages of addressing gun violence with the LAPD. He was revitalizing the community with real estate developments. He was one of the individuals behind this innovative concept of Destination Crenshaw, which is so fitting with the Howard University brand, where we enforce upon our social ambassadors, our students and our scholars to think about the next generations of movements. And in this project, it was known and described as a 1.3 mile open air museum designed as a cultural experience. The center on Crenshaw Boulevard was to feature a permanent and rotating art and design exhibits celebrating Black history and culture. And so when you think about the mind behind this phenomenon, it goes way beyond what we think of as an individual that's just part of a movement to destroy a community. In fact, he utilized that asset and that clout that he had with that population to draw individuals in to this concept of saying all money in, no money out. All of the resources of the Black community must be pulled together so that we can use it in order to uplift not only ourselves, but the community to come and the next generation. He was an advocate for STEM among the Black and brown individuals in his community and also across the nation. And the book that we're going to talk about today does a great job of talking about his nerdiness, you know, as it related to science and STEM. Oftentimes we think about Black boys that come from impoverished and disenfranchised communities in ways that they can't be intellectual, that they are, you know, only thinking about the next come up and the, you know, destruction of the next individual. But that's a colonized perspective of who we are. We often know that those individuals that have a sharp right hook and also a sharp left hook also are very intellectual and inquisitive when it comes to the ways that they engage with those individuals in these Black and brown communities. And through hip hop, it gives us the experience to not only think about these sort of components, but to expand upon them. He invested in the education of young people Specifically, he invested in 59th Street Elementary School in South LA. Being Howard University and one of the only HBCUs with a middle school on our campus, this resonates with me. He donated money to give a new pair of shoes to every student at the school, as well as helping renovate its basketball courts and playgrounds. We know that many individuals go into gangs to find love, to find support. And oftentimes theories come in and dictate from the criminological perspective that there's this middle-class measuring rod, why crime is concentrated in the lower class without looking at the lack of resources. Individuals that are raised in these communities, including myself, knows that a new pair of sneakers can keep you out of fights as it relates to being able to focus on your academics. So something as small or as large as this gesture really speaks to the heart of who we are here to celebrate and to talk about today. Nipsey Hussle teaches us a very important lesson. And that lesson is to serve the people. And to gain respect and trust, you must get it in the trenches and help solve issues identified by the community. It wasn't that he looked at it as though he was an expert. He spoke to the reality of what was going on. In the areas where he built all of these entrepreneurships and the stores that he had, there were individuals in his community that were hanging out in those areas. So why not create something to give individuals something to do? Individuals hanging out on community corners is not just about crime. It is also about communication. What is their presence on the street corners communicating to the world? And that only does not mean to bring in more police because they are criminal. It also means bringing in resources. Nipsey Hussle teaches us the willingness of others to pick up Hussle's mantle and continue his work, and how he was illustrating through his love of building community one by one, and reminding us that it never is the concept of being one and done, but also reminding us through his life and his legacy, through his marriage, through his children, and now through Howard University, that the marathon must continue. When I think about closing, I want to highlight strain theory, which puts an emphasis in criminological theory on the goals of getting forward in achieving the American dream. There is more emphasis put on making money than it is on the means to go about doing so. Nipsey Hussle reminds us that the American dream can be gained through innovation and through creativity, but also being true to yourself and to your community. I think this is a wonderful platform to engage in a further dialogue around hip hop in the ways that it not only motivates us, but also the next generations that are coming behind us. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Up next, the next digital informer is Dr. Roger Carruth. He is in the Department of Strategic, Legal, and Management Communication in the Cathy Hughes School of Communication at Howard University. His expertise is using interdisciplinary methods to study communication strategies across traditional, social, digital, and emerging media platforms. And he will talk about his research tonight. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed what everyone said so far. There are so many weaves that tie us together, and we probably would need 3 or 4 hours to continue this robust discussion, but I'll just talk briefly a little bit about Nipsey Hussle, my advertising and media background a little bit, and then also we'll bring Dwayne up, who will give us a little background about some of Nipsey's work, and then Rob and I get into a conversation, and we could continue from there. So I was introduced to Nipsey Hussle in the fall of 2018. As Dr. Muhammad said, most of our students are ambassadors. They have their ears on the street. So I generally try to strike up beginning conversations in class. So I asked one of the students what they're listening to, and he's from New Jersey, of course, New York, New Jersey, the tri-state area. He said, there's this cat out in LA named Nipsey Hussle. I said, really? He said, yeah, he has a little buzz. So I said, what do you think about him? And he goes, he's all right. So by him saying that, I knew he liked him, but because of the New York thing, and he can't be too pro. He's all right. So I said, okay, let me check him out. And that's when the Marathon Don't Stop just came out. So I started listening to it, kind of digesting some of the music. And then unfortunately shortly after that, he passed away. But what I try to do in classes is really talk to my students about making the connection between the broader scope of media, advertising, and marketing, and where they fit in these sequences. So we look at pop culture, we look at culture and business, and make relevant cases and connections, right? So I often ask the question, do you, as an artist, control where your art ends up, right? Because you create it one way, it becomes popular, it becomes mainstream, and then the conversations begin. Is this person a sellout? Is this real music? Is this real art? And it creates a robust dialogue of conversations like Brandon talked about, Dr. Hogan talked about earlier. So then when we pull back the veil and we look at it from a standpoint of marketing and advertising, and corporate America now becomes attached to some of these pop culture icons, because that's what they ultimately become after starting out in some of our communities. And then we have to look at how some of these artists are now understanding that process and really taking control of their image and really kind of working with corporate America to build mutually beneficial relationships. So when we look at that, hopefully Rob and I can get into that a little bit later on about products and services and brands and how they align themselves with artists at one point who were looked at in one way, but now become mainstream and become popular. So with that said, Rob and I could get into it, but I'll let Dwayne come on and give us some information about some things that he's discovered from Nipsey's song related to some of our research and study as a part of the Night Project, and then we can get into a deeper conversation. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Dr.
Oh. So next up is Dwayne Matthews. He is originally from Little Rock, Arkansas, and is a third-year PhD in the Sociology department at Howard University. He's focusing on inequality and criminology. But tonight, he is a fan of Nipsey Hussle, and he is going to share his love of the music through the lyrics that Nipsey Hussle shared with all of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think it's important to note when I was listening to the album Victory Lap, I constantly was listening to the undertones and listening to like these philosophical underpinnings of how it related to community empowerment, to civic engagement, to entrepreneurship and ownership, right? And then looking at those subcultures and those subtitles, I was able to kind of compare this to sociology, right? So within Soch, we constantly, well, within Howard in the sociology department, we have a constant conversation about W.E.B. Du Bois and E. Franklin Frazier, and how these individuals have are ethnographic in their approach, how they study community and how they study the black community specifically, right? And so Du Bois put out a book called The Philadelphia Negro, and where he just wanted to study the culture. And so with Nipsey's album, and also him being called Neighborhood Nip, he had this strong admiration for culture within South Los Angeles. And then so looking at a few of the lyrics, one song in particular was The Last Time That I Checked. There's a part he says, and I take my time and I take my tribe. Every level that I cross in this game like state lines. I was a visionary. Either I'm genius or y'all are scary. Maybe it's both. And this balance I deliver daily for every person in these streets trying to feed their babies, the single mama's working hard to not miss a payment, right? And then so he's acknowledging the pain. He's acknowledging the upbringing. He's acknowledging those who are less fortunate. He's talking to them directly to say, hey, keep doing you. The struggle will eventually end. And then so with that, it made me also think about maybe some of his influences, right? And so one of them in particular is Jay-Z. And there's a Jay-Z line from Moment of Clarity from the Black Album where he says, I can't help the poor if I'm one of them. So I got rich and gave back. That's the win-win, right? And so with that, he needed to make money in order to uplift his community. And then so you think about these other people that come from other rappers who turn into entrepreneurs. So like Jay Prince and E40 and Jay-Z and Puffy. Nipsey took that same type of capitalist approach, except he also put that in the community. So he made it a point to uplift community. So with projects such as Vector Go, which is a cultural hub, where people can learn about social capital, cultural capital, economics, and it's a STEM facility. So he's uplifting community. Or working with doing something called Destination Crenshaw, where it's a public arts project where he's trying to invest in the arts to keep the art community alive within South Los Angeles, specifically along Crenshaw. And then to make sure that history is preserved, despite or in spite of it being gentrified. In addition to the way that he was able to align himself with these individuals. So individuals like Marquise Harris Dawson, who was a LA city council member, and him being in alliance with Marquise Harris Dawson allowed Nipsey to actually engage community in that way and speak at these public forums, which is why in songs he says public council meeting, they got Nipsey speaking. Or the way he's able to align himself with billionaires such as Don Peebles, who was one of the main investors of his opportunities on projects along Crenshaw. But then family, and then there's the Crip community, and then there's also being inspired by revolutionaries like Mutulu Shakur, Afeni Shakur. So he was being pulled in all these different directions, and he was able to bring these things together and kind of create this amalgamation of what he thought community investment and development looked like. But then, he with that meant ownership, right? And so saying things like open trust accounts, deposit racks, $1 million life insurance on my flesh, we the no limit of the West, Percy Miller at his best, Jigga with the Rollie and the vest. So he's referencing two rappers, Master P, and who created No Limit Records and became a multi-millionaire by doing it out to Trump. And he's also referencing Jay-Z, who we know as to be a super capitalist, right? And so he's able to eloquently tie in all these different components, whether social, cultural, economic, and weave them into lyrics. And it's just amazing. But then to be inspired by books such as The Spook Who Sat by the Door, where within the book and the movie in particular, it's a gentleman. He infiltrates the CIA coming out of the west side of Chicago. He takes those teachers and he takes those learnings that he got from the CIA after X amount of years and being associated as one of them. He eventually leaves the CIA and he takes that back to West Chicago to inform his people on how to counteract COINTELPRO, how to counteract authority. Nipsey essentially did that same exact thing, right? Except he didn't have to put on a suit and tie to assimilate. Sometimes you have to put the medicine in the candy. And then so his outward appearance would have people thinking that he was just a gangster rapper, but he was so much more, this brilliant visionary. And he put it in his lyrics, but he didn't just come out and say it, in this blatant, all the time disrespectful way. He would say things disrespectfully. However, he would combine it with the intelligence of one who's familiar with Mutulu Shakur, who's familiar with Malcolm Gladwell, who's familiar with the Jays, who's familiar with the Tupac, and to kind of which is how he was able to have such an impact in the short amount of time that he had on this earth. But yeah, so see, his capitalism meets activism approach is the reason why we're talking about him today, and just on top of that being a lyrical beast. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Matthews. So what we're gonna jump into the meat of our program today, and I was trying to figure out how to, not super intellectualize the conversation, but have it at a level where we all could enjoy it. So hopefully we could do some of that. So what I want to start off by doing, first of all, is congratulating Rob on the book making the New York Times bestseller. So hopefully we can continue to add to that conversation today. And I'm going to start off by reading a quote, and from there I'll kind of give you an outline how I would like our conversation to go, Rob. And at any point, if you feel like we need to change direction, we can do that as well. But okay, cool. So here's a quote. It says, Rob Kenner was part of the original editorial team who brought my vision for Vibe magazine to reality. And during his 17 years at the magazine, he always did outstanding work. The Marathon Don't Stop is a beautiful tribute to a legendary artist. And could you reference who that may be, Rob?
That's Quincy Jones. That's the gentleman who made a record called Thriller. Some of y'all might have heard of it. And if you watch his documentary on Netflix, he was, touring the world with Count Basie and Frank Sinatra, and the list goes on. So even to be a tiny footnote in the Quincy Jones story is a huge honor for me. So you can imagine how I felt when I received that endorsement of my book, The Marathon Don't Stop. That was a humbling moment. I had to sit down on the sidewalk in New York City. I was overwhelmed. I checked my phone, and Q came through with that statement. And yeah, so, I just want to say before I go off on the Quincy, because we could talk about Quincy a long time, I just want to express my gratitude for this conversation. Dr. Middlemass, Dr. Hogan, Dr. Muhammad, yourself, Dr. Caruth, and the gentleman from Little Rock whose name escapes me right now. Everybody is dropping gems in this conversation. I'm just so grateful to be a part of it. And I really hope that Nipsey Hussle can feel this vibration where he is right now, because this is the type of thing, someone who did not finish high school, was asked to leave high school, but was building computers from parts, a genius, as he says on the record dedication. No, he a genius. He just can't claim it because they left him no platform to explain it. So here we are at one of the most prestigious learning institutions in America having this conversation. I just want to name that I'm very, very elated to be taking part in this conversation. So thanks to everybody.
Well, good. I mean, we have a lot to cover. I have, again, I'm trying to balance like a conversation versus my academic talking points, but I have about six I want to try and go over. And
let's go.
It can be somewhat swayed to the communication side. So, but I'll try to bring the other scholars, back in, and they can feel free to jump in. But I'll just go over those points and then get back into the meat of each of those things that I want to cover.
Cool.
The first is the value of relationships, right? And these are things that I try to embark on my students as we see them as freshmen, sophomores, all the way to senior year. Looking at it from my perspective, marketing and media, lived experiences, right? The idea of cultural activism, which I think is a lot in this book and a lot of things that were said earlier about Nipsey. And then the use of media in all its forms, right? And then a couple of points after that. So I'll start off with the first point in terms of the value of relationships. And one in particular which stands out in the book is a person, I should say, you mentioned in detail in this chapter on the hood. And that's Dexter Brown. And it struck me as a very important conversation to have, because Dexter has a connection to Howard, and it just shows you the reach of Howard and some of the things that we're talking about today. So if you want to share a little bit about that, and as you're talking, the points that I have, if I see a connection, I'll just jump in and ask you one or two questions about that, and then we can keep the program moving.
Absolutely. And I believe Dexter Brown may have joined us in the Zoom conversation. I was in touch and made sure that he knew about this. But Dexter Brown is one of the wonderful voices who trusted me to tell their story in my book, Marathon Don't Stop. I had never heard of him when I was researching the project, and he actually reached out to me via Facebook message when he heard that this book was going to happen. He's been left out of a lot of the histories of Nipsey Hussle's career, but I think it's very important that he be put in his proper perspective, because, without Dexter Brown, I'm not sure that we would even be talking about Nipsey Hussle today. He is a graduate of Howard, as you mentioned, a civil engineer by training, but a photographer by passion. And he and his wife, who was an art director for Jay Prince at Rap-A-Lot Records, they met at Howard and found their way to Los Angeles, bought a house there and started a new life. They wanted to live in a Black neighborhood. They wanted to give back to the community. That was a stated intention of theirs. And in the process of doing that, they met a gentleman named Cuzzy Capone, who informed them that they were also living in the heart of Rolling 60s neighborhood. And Dexter, rather than being alarmed by that, saw that as a creative opportunity, and he wanted to photograph and document the street culture of his neighborhood. And he invited Cuzzy into his home, where Cuzzy was delighted to find out that Dexter also had set up a recording studio. Although he himself was not a musician or even a producer, he knew that hip hop would be part of his creative adventure that he was setting off on in Los Angeles. And pretty soon, a skinny kid named Ermias started coming around, and his first interaction with Dexter was he opened up his code and had floppy disks for sale with software, Fruity Loops and Photoshop, things that he thought Dexter might be able to use. And so this was Nipsey Hussle before he went by the name Nipsey Hussle, and Ermias Ascadome eventually became part of the crew of young creatives who were finding refuge in Dexter Brown's home for, I believe it was a 7-year period. He was essentially living on and off in Dexter's house and learning about making music, learning about branding. So many lessons about media and entrepreneurship were learned in that home. And that was also where some of the earliest mixtapes were made. Slauson Boy Volume 1 is, on the streaming services, but there were others which are not on the internet, which were created there in that house. So Dexter played a huge role. And I'm very pleased that the Marathon Don't Stop puts him in his proper perspective as a key advocate for Nipsey at a crucial point in his development. And that's actually where the name Nipsey Hussle was bestowed on Ermias Ascadome, was in Dexter's house by young Gooch, another of the creatives who were attracted to this creative home that Dexter called Buttervision. So I'm happy that you asked about him. And we could talk a lot more about him, but one of the key points that I think is worth zeroing in on is that Dexter explained to Nipsey that major labels probably were not the way to go, that it was probably unlikely that they were the future. This was at a time that the industry was kind of imploding due to Napster and the downloading of music. But Nipsey really wanted to go up to the major label and get a chance to get a record deal. So Dexter took him to Interscope Records. And there's a scene in The Marathon Don't Stop where Nipsey plays some music for this exec at Interscope. And the guy listens to the music, and then he says, well, the music's a little rough, but you have a good look. Maybe you could get in the gym and get some lean muscle mass up and work with a choreographer, get some dance moves. And, we could maybe do something with that. And you can imagine Nip's response to that. He just stood up and said, come on, Dex, this meeting's over. Let's go. But this was where that whole concept of F the middleman is born, and the independent streak that Dexter was, teaching the young men who were working in his home. But Nipsey really took it to heart at that moment. And that's the beginning of the whole marathon, honestly, begins in that meeting, I believe.
Yeah, and to that point, I picked up a couple of things from that chapter that stood out to me. And there are key phrases and words that I kind of captured. One was digital guerrilla, right? Dexter used, and I thought that was timely, ahead of its time based on the time frame you're talking about. And the second quote, in part, says they should be releasing raw, uncut culture that would break the chains of digital slavery. And I hear things in that from the perspective of the people that he studied and read about, and how that correlates with where the industry was going. So now we're not going to major, we're going to do it on our own, but what's the future look like? And I think that might play into his aspirations and the knowledge that he had dealing with the bootleg Photoshop and the technology that he was using. So I don't know if you have a little minute to touch on that.
Well, I just think it's wonderful that this whole conversation is under the banner of digital informers, right? You've created a zone within Howard University where, not only can we be talking about having a hip hop major in the university, but, where there's a nexus of like-minded individuals who are coming together on Zoom to discuss the power of hip hop and of, you know, the forces that make hip hop the most powerful form of entertainment in the world, and harnessing that to the greater good of humanity. You know, and I think that nobody believed in the power of hip hop more than Nipsey Hussle. And to me, he is in many ways, the ultimate fulfillment of the purpose and potential of hip hop beyond just entertainment. This goes to something Dr. Muhammad was talking about, you know, this idea of hip hop as a force for community upliftment, and also, you know, to empower yourself economically, and then use that, as Nipsey did, to invest in the very community that first embraced you. And, you know, his example is a powerful one that, you know, I pray that will be emulated over and over again around the world.
And I definitely agree with that. So I wanted to do a little bit of inside baseball, because not too many people know how long we've known each other and our time in the music industry. But did at any point the boom shots come up while you were talking to Dexter from a?
Yeah, all the time, actually. Well, Dexter, of course, is based in Trinidad these days. And so he said he had done his homework on me before he decided to reach out to me. And I say again, you know, I'm honored by every single person who trusted me to tell their story of their relationship with Nipsey, because, you know, as the Big Sean record says, you know, the block loves Nip with a deep reverence. And for everyone who shared their truth with me, I offer my deep gratitude. But Dexter definitely looked into Boom Shots, which is my platform for reggae and dancehall. It started as a column in Vibe magazine. I didn't mention this earlier when you brought up Quincy, and my apologies, but I was a founding member of Vibe magazine starting in 1993, and was the only editor who stayed for the whole run of 17 years. So during that time, I wrote a column called Boom Shots, which was a dedicated space for dancehall and reggae music, which, as some of you tonight probably know, you know, Jamaican sound system culture is actually the roots of hip hop in many ways. Kool Herc was a Jamaican youth who came to the Bronx, threw a party with his sister, and that's the beginning of hip hop for, you know, all intents and purposes. So Dexter checked out my Boom Shots work, and I guess that might have helped win his confidence. And in any event, I'm very pleased that he decided to reach out to me, and that we were able to tell the story of Butter Vision, because it's an important chapter in understanding who Nipsey Hussle really is.
And I believe so. And I have to add, because at that point, just similar to hip hop trying to find its footing, there was no space for dancehall Caribbean culture, and Vibe magazine created that space, and a lot of artists kind of got their foot in the door from the segments that were done. So I think that was very important. So
thank you for that.
Sure. So I want to move on to the next point, which is kind of my area, which is marketing and media. And I know we talked briefly about the concept of the mixtape, and how in 2013, Nipsey took that and kind of spin that on his head. And I want to see if you could talk to that a little bit. And also him being a student of the music industry. Oftentimes our students see the visual parts, the glitz and the glamour, but they don't see the necessary homework, so to speak, that goes in. I know you touched on everything from him studying Jay Prince to E40, Jay-Z, Puffy, and all of those people that he studied brought different elements out of him that we see in his music and his business sense, because these individuals that he studied had different elements in terms of what they brought to the idea of hip hop and hip hop culture. So if you want to speak to that a little bit, and then I can jump back in.
Sure, absolutely. So, you know, Nipsey's mixtape catalog was robust, and the tape that you're referring to, Crenshaw, is now considered a classic, and it was a turning point for, I think, the wider music industry zeroing in on Nipsey's genius, not just artistically, but from a business standpoint as well. So with the Crenshaw tape, Nip had the idea that he had put in enough work and given his fans some really great music for free. All they had to do was log on to his website, give their email address, and he was blessing them with the marathon tape. The marathon continues. Now comes the Crenshaw tape, and he decided that on that project, he would ask his supporters to pay $100 for a limited edition physical copy of the CD. Now, this was at a time when no one was paying for music. And, you know, in fact, the tape was available for free download the same, you know, day as the Crenshaw pop-up in Los Angeles. But his belief was that if he asked his hardcore followers to support him, that they would be proud to pay. That was his concept and the slogan that he adopted. And he got the idea from a book that one of his mentors had recommended that he pick up called Contagious, which I encourage everybody to read. It's full of great ideas. But the case study that captured Nipsey's imagination was about a cheesesteak restaurant in Philadelphia that was selling this lowly street food that's probably $5 or less at most carts in Philly for $100. And you would get it with, you know, truffle oil sprinkled on top and a glass of champagne, and became like a prestige date. Oprah Winfrey came to have one of these $100 cheesesteaks. And of course, there were people who were outraged, like, who the heck do they think they are charging $100 for a cheesesteak? So it got people talking. Nipsey read that chapter and he just closed the book. He understood right away how he could apply that logic to his business. And that was the birth of the Proud to Pay movement. So by doing that, he also captured the imagination of Jay-Z, who recognized the brilliance of this move and wired $10,000 for 100 copies of the Crenshaw CD. But, you know, as crazy as everybody thought the idea was, the first night was a complete success. He moved $100,000 worth of CDs that first night. That was just the first of what would be many Crenshaw pop-up shops around the country. So this was a game-changing concept. And the other thing that he thought about was, I'm going to give my followers not just a limited edition CD, but they're going to have access to a concert, which will be only for my most ardent fans, you know, just a VIP only event. And that concept has now been co-opted by the music industry. So people like Justin Bieber and Taylor Swift now market their albums with what is called a bundle. And you buy, you know, a couple of concert tickets and a, you know, advanced copy of the CD. You can get it a little bit early. And this has now become part of the standard playbook in the music business. That is completely Nipsey Hussle's inspiration. And it's been, you know, the industry took it and ran with it because it's a brilliant idea. But, you know, the other thing that's cool to think about is the Crenshaw tape was hosted by DJ Drama, who is famous for his Gangster Grills mixtape series. Drama had actually been locked up for, you know, piracy because of the tapes that he was putting out. You know, it's a common practice in hip hop to use beats from famous records. You know, to Dr. Hogan's point, there is this whole system of references similar to academic citations in papers. You know, hip hop cites rhythm tracks and lyrics, and part of that conversation is using beats from other artists' records and flipping your flow over that. So DJ Drama, as a practitioner of these mixtapes, you know, and his Gangster Grills tapes became very powerful, breaking artists like Lil Wayne, T.I. to new levels, you know, and Jeezy and on and on. He ended up doing time, you know, because the industry targeted him as someone that was, you know, kind of a glitch in the matrix. He was making too many waves. And, you know, so he actually was arrested and, you know, did time because of his devotion to hip hop. And so it was entirely appropriate that Drama and Nip would come together on the Crenshaw project. And, you know, definitely a historic event in hip hop history. And from there on, Nip would do the Mailbox Money tape, which he sold for $1,000 a copy. You know, so he was never satisfied with, you know, his last success. He was always pushing the boundaries and testing the value of his creativity and the devotion of his fans. And, you know, that's why we're still sitting here talking about him today.
Yeah, and I think those are very valid points. And for me, the idea of branding, how you brand yourself, what type of risks are you willing to take to put yourself in a different position to capitalize on your art? And the idea of art, really, when we look at artists and when they create their art, is generally from their lived experiences, right? As we sit here, and Dr. Hogan did a great job of identifying, lyrics, and as well as Dwayne Matthews. And I'm trying to see if we can have a kind of a conversation about this idea of dissecting art from theory and practice, because art is very subjective, but sometimes people take it literally and don't take the time, as we're doing now, to kind of dissect it in various ways that could be applicable to us and our lived experiences. So I know that had a big impact on him being able to put out his last project, and some of the prior ones as well. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Well, when you talk about theory versus practice, I think of a phrase that Nip said over and over, that he always preferred demonstration to conversation. It's the same idea. Like when Migo said, walk it like I talk it, he was someone who believed that actions speak louder than words. And so his music was never a matter of boasting and exaggerating. He tried to keep the lyrics as close to his lived experience as possible. He has a line on Victory Lap where he says, "No exaggeration for the content of my songs," because his life was quite remarkable, and there was no need to embellish or exaggerate the things that he had experienced. And what he wanted to do was, leave a living testament for fans and scholars like the group that's assembled today to really think about what was possible in one human being's life, even someone who was born with very few means, with no powerful connections to speak of, who faced obstacles that might have seemed insurmountable, and yet managed to uplift not only himself and his family, but an entire community, and, spark the imagination of people all around the world. The other thing that comes to mind, which I definitely wanted to bring back, was something Dr. Muhammad said about, the tendency to underestimate and, misinform people about the potential of the intellectual power of young men growing up outside of, the academic and power structures. When Nipsey Hussle called himself Tupac of my generation, I made a point of asking him during our conversation around Victory Lap, what did he mean by that? Because Tupac represents so many things to so many different people. And it struck me that the part that he identified with, or the thing that he mentioned first to me, was that in our culture, as he put it, street culture, being smart is sometimes viewed as a form of weakness. And he believed that Tupac Shakur was a Trojan horse, as he put it, for the streets, that there was such a powerful intellect there, which he sort of masked behind this thug life image. But Nipsey could see through that. He could see the aspirations that Tupac had, and Nip felt that he could also relate to this idea of not wanting to appear too smart, because it might be rejected by some of the people that he wanted to really involve in his movement. And I thought that was an important concept to highlight, just as we're here at a acclaimed institution of higher learning, analyzing his work. And I think that's going to go on for a long time to come. I'm just happy that we're putting the first step on this marathon today.
So with that said, I have two more points or questions to ask, but this next one, I'll see if any of my colleagues want to jump in. And it's the idea of cultural activism. And for us here, when we look at communications in the Black community, we look at it in a lot of different ways. We have things that we hear in a barbershop, beauty salons. We rely on trusted sources in our community, stakeholders and influencers. And in this digital age, the digital influences. So I wanted to find out, when you look at that, and he makes reference to combining capitalism and activism, and these lines can be merged. They don't necessarily have to be very, polar opposites of each other. So I think I got some of that from the book and just kind of the references he made and the moves he made. where you can actually be culturally active in your community, but also try to pursue some of the corporate entities that will allow you to actually reinvest in your communities, and it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. So I don't know if any of my colleagues want to jump in and add to any points to this, but I thought that was very interesting.
No doubt. If anybody wants to jump in, go for it. I have a couple of thoughts that popped in my head just then. Shall I proceed?
Yeah. This is Dwayne speaking. Dwayne Matthews
Hey, yeah.
speaking. How you doing?
Good, good.
Again. Thanks for the follow on Twitter.
Hey, no doubt.
But no, I'm in the sociology department, so we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out capitalism and figuring out the power structure. A lot of Karl Marx conversation. But I think it says a lot, right, when especially people of color, Black folks in particular, in this particular case, where a lot of times it is a lack of economics, it is a lack of access, it is a lack of resources, and having that money and making sure and being invested in the community the way Nipsey was, I think it does indeed go a long way. But I think a lot of times too, capitalism gets a bad rap because of the exploitation of people. But in this regard, like what Dr. Muhammad said previously, is that when he got his money, or when Nipsey made money, he gave it to he employed folks who were incarcerated, who were less fortunate, and so I think his approach was absolutely genuine, because somebody that calls himself Slauson Boy or neighborhood Nip, you have to have that strong affinity for your neighborhood and the intention of wanting to uplift community. So capitalism, there is a love-hate relationship with it, probably with most sociologists. But at the same time too, when you kind of lift yourself out of the bootstraps and did not have anything, and then your intention is to lift as I climb, we look at things a little bit differently.
I want to hop in too. Oh,
no, go ahead.
Yeah, Dwayne, I think your points are interesting. I think if we want to think about Nipsey Hussle's model and also someone like Jay-Z's model as a critique of some philosophical ideas, so it seems that Marx has this notion that capitalism is necessarily exploits. And so one thing you can see Nipsey saying, well, it doesn't necessarily exploit. It exploits contingently based on the people that are participating. There's also a sense in which I think, looking from Hussle's position, the kind of woke position of being anti-capitalist is kind of a luxury. So it's kind of a luxury to say, like, corporations and kind of saying something wrong with the whole structure. I think from the ground level, at least what I'm seeing from this conversation, is a way of thinking about capitalism is like, this is a tool I have to grab onto at this moment to do well. I don't have time to sit back and have a thorough critique of it. I just wanted to add that.
No, that flows perfectly into the thought that I had. There's a lyric where Nip says, being broke is so un-American. That's why I'm screaming all money in. And I don't think he felt he had the luxury to engage in a critique of capitalism, because he recognized where he was born, and he recognized the terms of engagement of where he was living. And, it was about empowering himself economically and building generational wealth and owning real estate. Like, he understood that very early, picked up on it, and that was the hustle that he employed. But he also had the opportunity to visit Eritrea with his father and his big brother at a critical point in his development. And that gave him a perspective that not every society operates in the same way as American society. So he saw another way of life in East Africa where, everything stopped at midday, schools and businesses closed, and the families would come together for the midday meal, and every authority figure in Eritrea looked like him, from the president of the country down to someone that might be asking him for money on the street. Everybody was culturally like him and visually like him. And I think what he learned from that was, we talked about this in our conversation around Victory Lap, that, there weren't the same kinds of crime problems that existed in LA. In Eritrea, even though there was poverty, there weren't the extremes of wealth and poverty that you have in a city like Los Angeles, where, you know, people have the expensive cars, you know, and, you know, movie stars in the same city that you have, you know, extreme suffering. And, you know, the idea that in Eritrea, you could probably get a plate of food if you ask, you know, it's not that same kind of like roll the window up on the Lamborghini and drive through the bad neighborhood, so to speak. And I think that collectivism and that sense of community uplift was definitely inspired by his experience in Eritrea. But when he came back to America, he understood it was capitalism, you know. And one other point, when you compare it to Jay-Z, you know, Jay-Z is definitely one of the most inspiring success stories that hip hop has to offer. You know, we all know the difficulties that he overcame. He's put it in his music, and he is now a self-made billionaire. You know, it's an amazing demonstration of what is possible through the power of hip hop and business savvy. What's different with Nipsey, and why I think that he is the ultimate fulfillment of hip hop's purpose, is that, you know, he was able to build himself up also, but did it right there in the same shopping plaza where he first started. And, you know, just to put it in perspective, you know, Jay-Z did not try to open Rock Nation in the Marcy Projects. That would have been another level of complexity and challenge and pushback. And, you know, there's a lot that goes with trying to do something like that. So for Nip to attempt that and to succeed to the extent that he did is an overwhelming achievement. And, you know, I think he should be applauded for that. And obviously we saw the tragic, you know, events of March 31st, and we can't overlook that, but, you know, let's not miss the triumph of what Nipsey Hussle accomplished and apply the inspiration to future generations so that, you know, his example can be emulated.
Right. So thank you for that. I'm going to segue a little bit, have one more point, then I have our two graduate students come on who want to pick your brain, because I think there's certain topics that you touched on that they're gearing up to ask.
Cool.
Tyree and I on the School of Communications, we study media. And after we talked and had a meeting as the digital informers and decided to try to have this conversation that's taking place today, I wanted to make sure and see where you were going. So I tracked kind of, and I wasn't stalking you, but I just kind of tracked where you were going. So you were on WNYC, which is like our NPR station in New York, right?
Mm-hmm.
I saw you on GMA. I saw you on Sway in the Morning. I saw you at Greg Street in Atlanta. I have some roots. I even saw you talking to Uncle Ralph. And
yep.
Brooklyn kind of know who Uncle Ralph is. But my point is, when we have these important conversations and we have these stories to tell, these narratives, it needs to be told. It needs to be told in all mediums, not only in our insular communities, because we get to message out what we want and have a broader conversation and introduce people to various concepts. So I wanted to just kind of highlight that the uniqueness of your approach to telling this story. So it's not just being told to communities that that's only familiar with them. You're bringing it to broader audiences, which I think is a great point. So I just wanted to acknowledge that a little bit. And now I have Angela and Francesca come on and, you know, join the conversation, because I see them. They have some great things to talk to you about.
All right.
Is my sound on?
Yep.
Okay.
You sound nice.
Great, thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm really glad that I was able to hear all of my colleagues speak before me, because I have threaded a needle almost through what everybody has said, and it's beefed up the questions that I was going to ask you. So now they're a little extra meat in them.
Okay, let's.
Yeah, so, you know, we are digital informers, and so that means that communication kind of goes everywhere, right? To all different kind of audiences. And so, you know, obviously I'm looking at you and I'm wondering, okay, well, did you grow up in the Crenshaw area?
No, I did not.
So
No.
I'm thinking about the power of how Nipsey's music, and maybe even others before Nipsey, how did you come to say, hey, there's something deeper, there's a socio-political meaning behind lyrics of rap, whether it's Nipsey or before Nipsey? How did that reach you, where in your life, wherever it was in the LA area or whatever, how did you say, hey, there's something to this, there's something more? Because bridging those gaps is really important.
No doubt about it. I appreciate that question so much. So just so you know, I was born in California, but in Santa Barbara. My dad was an English professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And the book is dedicated to him. His name is Hugh Kenner. And the book was published on my late mother's birthday, Mary Ann Kenner, also an educator, a nursing teacher. And anyway, so I grew up as a professor brat, traveling the world, going to literary conferences and stuff with my dad, and left California at a young age, educated in Baltimore, and went to University of Chicago. And when I was coming out of college, all I wanted to do was tell stories about music. That was my ambition. So I wanted to get down with Rolling Stone. That was what I thought was the thing that I understood as a way to tell those stories. And I love music, and I love writing and reading. And so I wanted to combine those two things. And I had a job interview with Jan Wenner at Rolling Stone, and all he wanted to tell me about was Men's Journal, and I did not care about that. And so I said later for that. And so I was actually working at an art magazine, and on the weekends I was working in a record shop, a reggae shop called Irie Ice. I was DJing in clubs in New York. And so, you know, I was trying to bring those two parts of my world together. And when I heard Quincy Jones was launching a magazine called Vibe, I said, I have to be part of that. You know, that's my calling, you know? And so I started bombarding the editor at that time with letters every week with a stamp on an envelope. This is pre-email. And he was hearing from me a lot about what they needed to do in the reggae space. And I was assigned a story about Supercat in 1992. If people remember him, he's a very important dancehall artist who collabed with Notorious B.I.G. and Heavy D. And anyway, I did the Supercat feature in the test issue of Vibe. I guess people liked it, and they offered me a job in 93. And I quit my art magazine job and started at Quincy Jones's monthly Vibe. And it was the adventure of a lifetime. I was there for 17 years. As I mentioned, I was the only editor who stayed for the whole run. And one day in 2009, they shut the magazine down and marched us out because the bank had decided to repossess their investment or whatever. And, you know, it was a very disappointing day. But in 2009, it's a long wind up to answer your question, I met Nipsey Hussle for the first time. He came up to the offices of Vibe to present his Bullets Ain't Got No Name mixtape. I had never heard of him before. It was a very powerful first impression. I think everybody who was in the conference room that day remembers this young man, the energy he brought into the room. He was crackling with energy. He was so focused and excited to be up in Vibe. And I learned later while I was working on the book that he had been submitting headshots and demos to our next section, which was, if you read Vibe, it was like the new artist section in the front of the book. This is where Mary J. Blige and Outkast and Nas and Biggie got their first look in Vibe. So that was the goal that Nipsey set for himself. I want to be in the next section. And like every other goal that he set, it was a high bar, and he didn't get there easily, but he persisted and he persisted and he found a way. I learned later he was getting a little salty that we weren't getting back to him. But he finally made his way up into the office of Vibe. And at that point, it felt like a victory lap to him, I think, you know, just to be there and present his music. And I remember so powerfully, he played a track off Bullets Ain't Got No Name called Dre Jackin' for Beats, which is him flowing over the gin and juice beat, which is not a trifling matter. You have to know what you're doing with a track like that. And I encourage everybody who's listening to this, if you haven't listened to Volume 1 of Bullets Ain't Got No Name lately, just do yourself a favor and check out that song, what he's saying on this song and the power of his words. It just hit me very hard. And I had a strong sense of deja vu also because we had done the first cover on Snoop in '93 at Vibe. And, you know, this is a time in hip hop where it was more like Do the Stanky Leg and Teach Me How to Dougie, and lighter kind of records were running the charts at that time. So it was very refreshing to me to hear some hard LA rap. And I just knew this was a special person. You know, I didn't grow up where he grew up. I didn't have the same experiences in life, you know, but I had been a music journalist for my entire life. And I could tell this was someone who was very special. And after he presented his tape, I took him to the side and just shook his hand. And I said, you know, keep doing what you're doing. This is really great stuff. We're going to give you all the strength that we can. And, you know, I'm going to be listening. I'm going to be paying attention as you move forward. And he got his 1 page in Vibe, which he talked about on records. You know, it was like a milestone for him before I got that page up in the Vibe. But then soon after that, Vibe folded because we didn't have a very good digital strategy at that time. But Nipsey's digital strategy was excellent, and he was on the way up. And so I stayed tapped in. As we talked about earlier, when the Crenshaw tape hit, I was at a place called Complex, which some of you all know is known for a lot of snappy lists, do a lot of like funny lists, like hottest rappers. And sometimes like what they had was the underachieving rappers. And so Complex basically dissed Nipsey on this list, said, you know, why are you such an underachiever? Now, of course, this was unbeknownst to us, all the things he was going through in LA and, you know, the decisions he had made to take control of his career, just street things that were going on, a lot of factors combined why he hadn't put out a project in a while. And very soon after that, he dropped the Crenshaw tape. Jay-Z bought the $10,000 worth of CDs and the whole world was suddenly sweating him. So when one of my colleagues at Complex reached out and said, we're big fans, Nipsey, we want to interview. He tweeted, F Complex, you know, 10 racks for an interview or stop emailing my management. And, you know, I remember chuckling to myself because, you know, that's exactly the appropriate response, I think. And, you know, there was a meeting in the office and I was like one of the voices that said, look, we need to just get him on the phone, talk to him and let him say whatever he wants. Do not censor him. Do not mute him. Let him speak fire to Complex, whatever he wants to say, just let him say it. And that interview is one of the greatest interviews he ever did because he really spoke passionately. He was usually very composed and even tempered in interviews, but he was pissed off that day. And the things that he said really separated himself from the rest of the hip hop industry. And, you know, he always knew the first single on Victory Lap was going to be the song that it was, the rap ends, you know, and the whole statement of that song is I ain't nothing like these other rappers. You know, I am very different in my outlook and my approach and everything. And I think he was beginning to express that in that interview that my colleague Angel Diaz did for Complex. So long answer to your question, but it's a good question. And, you know, so that was my my instinct that there was something special about him. And then the ultimate fulfillment of that was when I interviewed him for Victory Lap. You know, I had him just come up to the office as a mass appeal. It was the earliest appointment I've ever booked for a rapper's interview. It was 9:30 in the morning and he was 10 minutes early and our crew was ready. And, you know, he sipped his green tea and dropped gems for over an hour. And at the end of that, I said, oh my goodness, this is so much bigger than this 5-minute YouTube video that we're going to produce. And I have an obligation to tell this man's story more fully in a larger scale. And that was the birth of what became the book, The Marathon Don't Stop, right then.
That's awesome. That was my thread through philosophy from, you know, what Dr. Hogan was talking about. And it seems like that was really, you know, you were kind of in tune with that from early on, and it just kind of grew and grew. And when you met him, it sounds like it just really popped. Just a really quick follow-up, because I'm an Africanist and, you know, my work is in Africa. And I work in the slums of Nairobi in Kenya. So I'm in the trenches. And I just wanted to say that, Nipsey's music, we're talking about digital informers. Music has no borders. Art has no borders, which I think Dr. Caruth said earlier. And then tying into what Dr. Muhammad was saying about, I call it community-led development. Nipsey, I don't know if you ever considered, or if Nipsey ever considered, that his music would touch lives of people who live in the slums of Kenya, and that they would emulate his community-led development by trying to better themselves from within the slums, keeping money in the slums, trying to build entrepreneurship. And it's amazing that, that his influence really went that far. And I guess my question to you is, did you have any idea, or did he have any idea that, his leadership and his model of leadership could make it all the way to, I guess I would call it Destination Mukuru, since he's doing Destination Crenshaw. Mukuru is the second largest slum.
That's amazing. I want to make sure I understand what you're telling me, because I'm learning from you right now. You're saying that not only is his music popular in this part of Nairobi, but that his business practices are being adopted, that his philosophies are being put into force. Yes. That's amazing. That is really wonderful to hear.
Awesome.
I don't know if he knew that those principles would be put into force. I know for sure that he was aware that his music could reach anywhere on the planet, and that was a very intentional thing for him. He was, as we've talked about, very technologically savvy, and he traveled to Japan before he even did his deal with Epic Records to do the Bullets Ain't Got No Name tapes. Like, he was a global artist right from early. And the story is told in the book also that, Afeni Shakur invited him to fly into Atlanta before he was even called Nipsey Hussle. He was rapping under the name Concept. She heard one of his early tracks and invited him to perform at an event for her son Tupac, who, had a posthumous album, Better Days, that was being put out. And she wanted Nip Hussle there to perform. So it's mind-blowing, the connections. But to your point about Africa, he would have been thrilled to know that. I'm sure of that. And one of the things that I learned, and which I share in the book, about his second trip to Eritrea, on his first journey, he had some of his early recordings, and he would go to a record shop in Asmara, the capital city, and play them in the shop. And he would say, "You're going to hear about me one day. I'm going to be a famous rapper." And sure enough, in his second trip to Eritrea, he had put out Victory Lap. He was a famous rapper. He met with the president. He and his father and brother met with the president of Eritrea. He did interviews with the state media. So there's this amazing interview with a reporter from the newspaper in Eritrea who's asking him questions, like very basic questions, which he answered in great detail, like, what is hip hop? And are gangs scary? And, very open-ended questions that he patiently unpacked, because he wanted the African audience to really understand what he was about. He wanted them to understand his larger goals, not just to listen to his music. And one of the neat details of that interview is that, the reference that his name is based on, Nipsey Russell, the famous comedian and poet, really doesn't mean very much in Eritrea. They're just not as familiar with him as we are here. But his name sort of sounds like the word Nebsy, which is a term which is kind of roughly equivalent to homeboy or friend. And so that became the name for him in the streets of Asmara and throughout Eritrea. And during this interview in the national newspaper, the reporter said, "Do you want to change or correct that, since people are calling you Nebsy?" And he seemed very pleased with that and said, "No, that's perfect. Just keep it just like that." So, I believe if he had more time on Earth, he would have spent a lot more time in Africa. I think that he was calling Eritrea home, and he would have had a residence there, or done more than just visit his family out there. There would have been an African strategy in his mission, and I'm thrilled to know that Nairobi has tapped into the marathon.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today and for all the knowledge and for everyone who has spoken today. It's been so amazing. So I'm very grateful to be here and for having the space. I would like to ask you more, I guess, I'm studying to be a speech language pathologist, so I study a lot of language, and you have been, and a lot of people have been using lyrics and phrases in order to make a greater point. So I would like to know how you think that, how Nipsey Hussle's lyrics and music has further connected the Black community, as well as how you think that African-American English in particular has also connected the Black community in LA. And I guess a little bit too about the writing process. I would like to know if you included a lot of African-American English, or is it more standard American English, and how do you think those differences kind of play a role in community building, particularly in LA?
That's a very, very astute question and a deep one, and there's so many layers to it, but let me jump in and peel back as much as I can. I think in my whole career as a music journalist, I have thought it was very, very important to capture the spoken language as accurately and faithfully as possible, even in print. We had lengthy debates at Vibe during the early years, at Time Inc. magazine about hip hop. And, there was a conversation very early in our session where the question was raised about, should hip hop be taught in colleges, and should, at the time in the early days of Vibe, Time Inc., there were people that said, will hip hop fans read a magazine? Is there any point to publishing a magazine about hip hop? These were real conversations that went on. So, I was very clear in my mind that the language, the precision of slang and lyrics should be very faithfully recorded on the printed page. And we set up our own way of copy editing and proofreading things that have a lot of nuance to, broken language and, specifics of, in my column, boom shots, rendering Jamaican patois on the page, and, the difference of that to hip hop slang and how things move from one cultural context to another. So in the case of Nipsey, absolutely, he was very aware of these differences. There's an interview where he was invited on Larry King to talk about, I think the issue had come up because there was like a Justin Bieber video where he was using the N-word. And so anyway, there was this debate that Larry King hosted where he had various people come on and talk about hip hop and the N-word. And Nipsey very strongly defended his use of that term in music and said that for him, the distinction was, I don't use the word that ends ER, I use the word that ends with an A, and there's a very different meaning to that word. And all my friends use it and say it and pronounce it in that specific way, but if we're writing it, that's the way we write it. So he was aware of these types of nuances. And, I don't bring up that example lightly. I know it's a very charged topic, but, just to get to your point, this is why language matters. And, choices of words and choices of spellings have a huge impact on things. There was a conversation we had earlier about capitalism. And one detail, which I don't believe actually made the final edit of my book, but it comes up, just had to be cut for space. But everybody knows that Nip did a sneaker deal with Puma and did apparel, with Puma. But prior to that, there was a deal on the table to do a sneaker in partnership with Reebok. And Reebok and Nip at a certain point decided to part ways. I don't know exactly how it went down this way, but basically they put their shoe out, and then he very quickly disavowed the shoe and said, you know, my lawyers are going to be talking to them. And basically on the shoe, they had certain words that are associated with Rolling 60s, certain specific choices of words that have great resonance for that community. One shoe on the tongue, I believe, said rich, and the other said rolling. And rich rolling is a term that has a specific meaning within the 60s. So, you know, he felt very strongly that he could not endorse a shoe like that. You know, he said there's people that are doing life, there's people that have lost their lives behind this culture, and you can't just be selling that on a sneaker, you know? So, you know, this is an example of his sensitivity to the power of words and specific word choices. And, you know, for a corporation to market a sneaker, you know, I can only assume that some of that creative was, you know, kind of fast forwarded without his supervision, and would probably not have reached the point of, you know, a prototype being produced and photos put on sneaker blogs with it, you know, if he had been involved in that process more closely. But once Reebok went ahead and put that shoe out, he very quickly distanced himself from it and said, we're not messing with this. And, you know, the shoe is not available for sale. I don't know if anybody ever got promotional copies of it or whatever. But anyway, this is to answer your question about language. You know, words have power, words are meaningful. And, you know, putting the words rich rolling on a sneaker opens up a whole set of liabilities and a whole set of issues that Nipsey was not interested in, no matter how big the check was that went along with them.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. There's a lot more that we could talk about language. This is like a whole.
I know it. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Lewis is Dean Lewis.
All right. Hi, Rob. So
Hi.
I'm a physicist, and so one of the things, you know, I think about when I think of rap and lyricists and the connection with science is that in order to solve problems, you have to think outside of the box. You know, you have to be creative. And so this is a very engaging conversation. So one of the things I wanted to discuss is if you have any insights or perspectives into the Vector 90, the co-working space that he collaborated with to put together with David Gross. And in the book, I read that, you know, in this space, he offered STEM classes, and I think a couple of my colleagues mentioned that. Yeah. And for me, I thought he could have easily have done classes in humanities or social sciences or health sciences. However, he chose STEM. And I just wanted to know, do you have any insight into why STEM? I mean, I know why it's important as a physicist, right, and you know, in the community to get young people involved. But I wanted to know, you know, I think Dr. Muhammad mentioned, you know, him being a nerd, and people don't think of, you know, when you're a scientist or you're a nerd, you also have this creative energy that you have to tap into. And some people think that's the only way you can get to it is through science, but you can also get through it through linguistics or, you know, through being a lyricist. So I wanted to hear your perspective about what he had in mind when he decided to offer those STEM classes.
Such a great question. I'm happy that you asked that. So yeah, in hip hop, the slang term like dropping science can mean a lot of different things, right? It's, you know, it's just a term of high praise for your lyrical prowess. But for Nip, it meant actual scientific research. And we've already mentioned that he was someone who could build a computer from parts by reading an article in a magazine. But, you know, he was also someone who was interested in science and technology, just on, you know, as an area of inquiry. I asked him when he was explaining to me about Vector 90, what difference would it have made to a young Airman Saskadone if you had a facility like this available to you to, you know, pursue all of your curiosity? And he said, I don't know, but it would have made a big difference. It would have changed the trajectory of my life. I'm not saying I wouldn't have done music, but, you know, I was always interested in science and space exploration and all these kinds of things. And in another interview, he was asked, if you didn't do music, what would you have done? And he said it would have been something about, you know, space or exploring, you know, satellites. And so that was just, his mind was a powerful thing. And hip hop was the most, you know, it was a passion from childhood. And it was also the most accessible on-ramp to success that he had in front of him, you know, but he had to build a computer to create beats and to share music. And, you know, so it wasn't easy even to get into the hip hop space. But if he had full access to all these different areas, who knows what he would have done with that beautiful mind that he was born with and that his mother, you know, nurtured so caringly. The other thing that I think is important to point out is when Vector 90 first opened, there was a campaign that he and David Gross put together called Too Big to Fail. And that is a phrase that goes back to the time of the financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, which is part of the reason Vibe folded, by the way. But that term, too big to fail, was applied to certain financial institutions that the head of the Federal Reserve considered were too powerful to let them go out of existence. And so tax dollars had to be, you know, diverted to these corporate giants that had profited off of junk bonds, a lot of unscrupulous deals. And so our tax dollars bailed out these Wall Street corporations because they were deemed too big to fail, right? So Nip flipped that logic, and he said that the people of Crenshaw were too big to fail. The people of his community were too big to fail. And it was a travesty that a resource of human potential was not being maximized into the tech industry, for instance, which is, you know, based in California, right? It's not that far away. You can take a short flight from, you know, LAX up to Silicon Valley. And, you know, he had in Vector 90 on this day when he invited media and investors to come in and, you know, see what they were building. You know, he pointed out, he pointed out on charts that the major tech companies, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these tech giants had woefully low employment of African Americans, Latinos. You know, his reasoning was that, you know, the excuse that they're going to give is that people are not trained enough in the coding and, you know, science, technology, engineering, mathematics to compete for these jobs of the 21st century. And so the reason that he felt it was so important to start a STEM center in his neighborhood is not just because he as a child, you know, remembers his, you know, nerdy aspirations, but that he saw the economic realities that to compete in this day and age, you had to be trained for these jobs. And he knew that the ability was there. He knew that the human potential was there, but the resources and the training were not accessible. And that's why he wanted to start a STEM center in Vector 90. And that's why he did that. And, you know, he also understood, by the way, that these tech companies that are worth billions of dollars, a lot of the value is based on hip hop celebrities. You know, a lot of the value comes, you know, where would Clubhouse be, you know, the latest hot app, without hip hop? You know, where would Instagram be without hip hop? You know, Versus that unfolds on Instagram is all based on, you know, Jamaican sound system culture and hip hop, this battle concept. You know, a lot of American and world entertainment flows from what we're talking about tonight is, you know, beats and rhymes. And, you know, Nipsey understood the value of that in a profound way, in a way that most artists or even label execs do not understand it. And he was adamant that the full respect be given to this art form. And so, you know, as a self-made mogul, he wanted to take meetings in Silicon Valley. He had some ideas for technology plays that he wanted to do. And let's not forget, the Marathon clothing store had some of the most advanced technology of any retail business in the world. You know, the NBA store did not have this virtual augmented reality stuff that he and Idris Sandhu had through the Marathon clothing app, where you could use your smartphone, hold it near the hand tag on a Crenshaw jersey, and access, you know, video content, which didn't exist anywhere but on that hang tag, on that shirt. You know, so there's a lot of answers to this question. You touched, you know, just the tip of an iceberg here, but yes, you had a good instinct that, you know, there was more to it than just you know, paying lip service to STEM because it's a good idea to, you know, do some positive thing like that. You know, he felt that very strongly and knew the power of it.
Right. And that was one of the things I really liked about you. Brought that out in the book. I loved his ability, or your ability, to capture his awareness and his self-reflection, right, on what would have happened if he had this, and then the ability to capture his vision, right? So I didn't have this, but let me go beyond this to bring it to people. So thank you very much for answering that question.
I'm just thrilled to have this dialogue with y'all. And I want to say again, just while you're talking about the book, you know, when you write anything, everybody in this conversation knows about reading and writing and what it is like. You know, sometimes you feel like you're groping in the dark. You know, we're just putting marks on a page that are interpreted by someone that's not in your mind. They don't know the thoughts that you have. I knew that this was a complex individual, and I wanted to show the full complexity and all of the reasons that he mattered. And for people that don't understand why, there was this big memorial at the Staples Center for a mixtape rapper that never got major magazine covers or anything like that. You know, why was he important? And so it's just thrilling. Again, I said this earlier, but I hope Nipsey Hussle can feel this vibration right now. And, you know, certainly his family and everyone who cares about him has got to just understand this is so important what we're doing here today. And I hope that this is just the first lap of a marathon, intellectual marathon in Nipsey Hussle's honor.
Thanks again, Rob.
Thanks, Rob. So we're going to continue to feature some of our brilliant students. And so Desiree Crawford has some questions for you.
Hello, Mr. Kenner. So I was just wondering how your interviews with Nipsey changed you, because we all know, we learned so much about him after he passed that we just didn't, and it just made it so much more sad how incredible he was. So how did your interviews with him change you?
Profoundly, it would be the one word answer. You know, when we were speaking, especially, you know, that long form interview around the Victory Lap project, you know, I was asking him about how he had overcome the limitations placed on him by the record industry. And, you know, of course, everybody by now has gotten the memo that he was a visionary business person who, you know, looked at the game completely different and disrupted the ways of doing business that most rappers have to go along with, or they feel they'll be left out of the major label industry. But, you know, when he was talking about the record industry, it also made me think about my experience as a creative writing and, you know, working in various publications. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I was at Vibe for 17 years, and I never imagined that I wouldn't be at Vibe. You know, I just felt so proud and happy to be a part of that. I'm so blessed to be part of Quincy Jones's vision. You know, it never occurred to me to have a plan B, you know, but on that day when the magazine was shut down, the bank decided their investment wasn't working out the way they wanted, and, you know, they pulled the plug on Vibe. You know, we were all told to stand up from our desk and walk toward the elevator and don't touch anything because it all belongs to the bank now. And, you know, I had no clue what I was going to do. You know, the floor dropped out from under my feet. And, you know, I made my way through various other digital publications. I was at BET for a while, Complex, Mass Appeal, and, you know, it was fine. But, you know, I realized that I didn't really own anything. You know, I haven't built my own business. So it was around the time that Vibe was on its way out, I started boomshots.com, which was the digital platform connected to my reggae column, Boomshots. And at least then I had a platform which I could control. I didn't have to pitch stories to a publication. If I thought it was important, I could put it on Boomshots. And today Boomshots is still going. We have a YouTube channel and various, partnerships that we do. I'm actually working with Vibe again through Boomshots. We just did a documentary on Skip Marley, Bob Marley's grandson, which I hope everybody checks out. It's called Let's Take It Higher. It's got him, Skip, and her, who you might remember their duet Slow Down, and talk to his mother Sedella and grandmother Rita Marley. It's a dope doc, but these are the kinds of things that I'm able to do because I invested in my own platform to be able to greenlight projects. I don't have to pitch them and have somebody else believe in it. I can just go forward and do it. But when I spoke to Nipsey about his approach to the rap game, he said, the rules of the rap game were not made by artists. If they were, they would be way different than they are. They were made by business people seeking to extract the maximum value from creative people because they figure, artists love making art, so they're just going to do it anyway. And the people love music. They can't get enough of it. So if we can get in between them and extract the value of that transaction, the fans are always going to want the music and artists just love doing it. So we can set up a mechanism that's going to extract all the wealth from that. And the artists will be famous, but they might not, be able to pay for their kids' college when the time comes, So this was something that Nipsey understood, and it offended him and it motivated him to build a new way. And, that was Proud to Pay. That was, F the Middleman. That was all of the things that he demonstrated through his career. And, when I thought about my own experience in the media, I realized, that was similar to what I had gone through, and I love the fact that I was part of Vibe, and all love and respect to Quincy. This is not a criticism of that, but it's just an awareness that having a job isn't really it. You have to build your own foundation at some point, and you have to be able to stand on your own feet so that the floor doesn't fall out from under you suddenly, because it could happen at any time. And so Nip's insights on business profoundly influenced me. And another thing that happened was, that morning he came in, he drank the green tea, and we talked about why he doesn't drink coffee. And I basically kind of got into a healthy living thing inspired by him, Dr. Sebi and the diet and all of that stuff. And I don't know, if you look at the picture of me and Nip when we did the interview, I was about 70 pounds heavier than I am now. So I lost a lot of weight while working on the book, and just, I give him credit for that influence on me as well. That was a life change that needed to happen. And so, I'm ready for maybe not an actual 26-mile marathon, but, better able to do my writer marathon than before.
Okay, and also, it just feels like he was on the precipice of something great when he was creating the Victory Lap. And we know he had mixtapes, but what was his mind state when he was recording? What was his thought process? What was going on with him during that process?
Well, I wasn't in the studio with him when he was recording, but from what I've been able to gather, he was somebody who kind of had a perpetual state of writer's block. He was a perfectionist, and there were definitely a lot of sessions where if it wasn't perfect, he wasn't gonna go in the booth and lay down his verse. And he had records that he would perfect over a period of years and redo until he felt they were ready. And that was just the way he was. He was also, because he had his hand in so many different businesses, and he was involved in community things and street situations and a lot of different things that were pulling on his attention at any given moment. So he could be in the studio and get a text and have to deal with the situation. And just so when he was able to focus and lock in and make a special record, you get something like Blue Laces too, which the story of the creation of that record is in the book, where, he starts out talking just about his accomplishment in music and the fact that he's, a mogul, and they know that logo on the floor mat, and just kind of, bigging up his chest. But as each verse continues, it goes deeper and deeper until that third verse of Blue Laces, if, I'm not going to attempt to quote it right now, but it's such a powerful anecdote about a personal experience that he went through. One of his comrades fell victim to gunfire, and he's got to drive him to the emergency room, and his girlfriend is, very traumatized, to say the least, and they're making plans of how he's going to drop him off at the ER without getting caught, and he's going to, they make plans of, what to say and how this happened. We're not going to speak on it. And, they just, it's such a powerful narrative. And, he tells the story of how the inspiration hit him. And there was a trusted friend and confidant in the studio who could just feel that the spirit was moving in him. And, when he did the first verse, he was ready to go do something else because he had lots of other stuff to attend to. But this man in the studio said, no, you're on some vibes right now. Keep going, do the second verse. And then after he laid the second verse, he said, no, something special is happening there. Keep going, finish it. And, none of this was written. None of this was prepared. And by the time he dug deep, that third verse is like one of the greatest things in his entire catalog. And it's just because he was in that zone, and so like a lot of his lyrics were not written out by that point in time. He was coming off of, over a decade of lyrical excellence, and he had reached a point where the beat would speak to him and it would just flow through him. And, that's executing at the highest frequency of MCing. And, Nipsey had reached that level at that point. So I hope I've answered this question. It's long.
No, that was great. You're giving us stuff we would have never known. So thank you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, some of that's in the book, but some might not be. So.
Thank you so much, Rob. This is what makes this conversation so fabulous, is that we get insights from you about your writing process, but also then the impact Nipsey Hussle had on your life, and then his larger impact on the Black community through his entrepreneurship, through thinking about marginalized populations that don't normally get on the radar of so-called important people.
Exactly.
Yeah, so as we bring this evening to a close, do you have any final remarks you would like to make?
Well, gosh, that's there's a lot of wonderful tangents that we've explored tonight. And again, I just want to thank all of you at the Howard University community for inviting me to take part in this conversation. I think this is a victory for hip hop to have this dialogue, and one that I trust will continue. I know it's something that Nipsey Hussle would have wanted. I think he held himself to the highest possible standard, and I hope that everybody who loves and respects him is proud of this conversation taking place. Another thing that we haven't touched on very much tonight, I think the record FDT was mentioned, but I think it's important to underscore it here, since we're at least virtually in Washington, D.C., right? So, when Nipsey performed at Broccoli Fest in Washington, D.C., he closed his set with FDT. And, he knew that it was important to perform in the nation's capital, a record where he and YG impeached candidate Trump, before the United States Congress got around to it. And, earlier this year in 2021, there was a coup attempt on the American government, led by, forces who were inspired by President Trump, and some of whom were, violent, racist gangs who are, cloaked in the aura of respectability, perhaps. But, when we talk about, Dr. Muhammad's remarks earlier about, reducing Nipsey to a gang member or a gangbanger. We need to know who the real gangsters are. And, one of the things that I wrestled with in my process of researching, writing this book, was to understand how a young mind like Nipsey's, who could build his own computer from parts, ends up deciding to get involved with the Rolling 60s, and what are the series of, factors that led to that decision. Because, growing up in America, our understanding of gangs, as Dr. Muhammad mentioned, is that they are a destructive force and they ruin communities. And, so in the process of, of researching the Marathon Don't Stop, I learned about gangs like the Spook Hunters, who I had not heard of before, but, that was a racist white gang that was aligned with the police force in Los Angeles. And they had jackets which had a logo of a Black person being lynched on the back of their jacket. And they would harass Black students on their way to school. They would terrorize Black families who dared to move outside of the areas that they were limited to based on policies like redlining and restrictive covenants and property deeds and things that prevented the Black community from expanding and thriving. So, in response to groups like the Spook Hunters, you had groups like the Slossons, which Nipsey references often in his music. It wasn't just a street for him. The Slossons was a neighborhood organization that was formed to defend Black neighborhoods and Black families. And, when we talk about gangs, we're talking about a defense mechanism as much as anything else. And, although the story of the Slossons leads through, Bunchy Carter opening up the LA chapter of the Black Panthers, and then the FBI eventually, attacking the Panthers, as we saw in the film Judas and the Black Messiah. What happened to Fred Hampton in Chicago, something similar happened to Bunchy Carter in Los Angeles. And, from the ashes of the Panthers rose the Crips and later the Bloods. And there's a film called Bastards of the Party, which I strongly recommend to everyone. If you haven't watched it, it was an important source for me in understanding this period of LA history. So Nipsey was aware of all this stuff. He understood about COINTELPRO. He understood what the Slossons meant. And I believe part of his decision to join the 60s was a desire to return this organization back to its original intent and purpose. And so the record FDT, to bring it back around, is an effort by YG from a Blood affiliated neighborhood and Nipsey from a Crip affiliated neighborhood to unite the streets of LA at a time when candidate Trump is demonizing Mexicans, throwing Black students out of rallies in Georgia, being endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, and nobody in hip hop other than YG and Nipsey spoke truth to power and condemned what he was doing. And so that record, FDT, is a very, very important use of hip hop as a organizing tool, a political force. And although they were not successful in preventing Trump's election, the record was streamed millions of times on election day 2020. So we can thank them for helping to turn the tide and bring in the Biden and Harris ticket. And, it's an important record. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in Howard University conversation.
Excellent. Thank you so very much. We really do appreciate you. And in final closing, the Howard University Digital Informers would really like to thank Patrick Sajat for his technological skills in making us all sound and look good this evening. Thank you, Patrick. We'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and the Cathy Hughes School of Communication for their continued support. And we'd like to thank the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for its support. And a huge thank you again to Rob Kenner for sharing his thoughts about the game and the genius of Nipsey Hussle. Everyone, please stay safe, mask up, and take care of yourself. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks.